Hey everyone, welcome to episode 114 of BIM, or 15. I should actually double check that. Might be 115, but either way, welcome to a new episode of BIM After Dark Live. My name is Jeff, also known as the Revit Kid. Thank you for joining us. If you're here live on 9 p.m. Eastern Time on a Thursday night, thank you for joining. If it's your first time, make sure you subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. This is a weekly live stream where we talk about BIM, Revit, and kind of anything adjacent to the AECO technology side of things. But if you're here live, you also have the added benefit of being able to chat and ask questions along the way. So I urge you guys to ask questions along the way. As I mentioned before, this is episode 115, 114, something like that. If you haven't, you'll see ticking behind me is a subscriber count. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so that we keep ticking that thing up and we make our way to the 100,000 subscriber mark, and I can put a silver little YouTube logo up on the wall. But yeah, let's jump into the content. We have an awesome guest today. We're going to be talking about AI, but something probably that you maybe haven't seen too much of, or maybe a concept that you guys haven't been familiar with. And I think what I'm going to do is probably just introduce our guest right away and jump right into it. So without further ado, let me make sure your audio is on. Marty Rose Maneth, right? Did I do it right?
Yep.
Welcome to the show, Marty. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Marty is coming on to talk
Pretty
about
fun.
a platform called Schema, and we're going to learn all about that. But I think before we jump into what that does and some of the really awesome stuff that it can do for you, I think maybe what we'll do is let you introduce yourself, Marty, and let everyone here know who you are. It's your first time on the show, so thank you so much for joining. And maybe give everyone a little background on yourself, what you do, and how you sort of got to where you are today.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, real quick. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I'm surprised our paths haven't crossed more.
Hmm.
So, my background, I guess the thing I'm best known for from all the people looking at Schema is that I was with the original Revit startup team back at Charles River Software before we even named it Revit Technology Corp. And so I was running the product requirements team for the first 7 years.
Hmm.
Um,
7 years.
yeah.
Wow.
Uh, from 99 to roughly, my team was responsible for the things that shipped up to '06.
Hmm.
The, and so after that, I did a bunch of manufacturing and construction startups because I always was really interested in how to take the design data through into means and methods.
Hmm.
Been a bigger challenge than, there's a lot of people interested in that topic, but it's a big challenge, right? And so, after doing a number of startups in that area, some of which were killed by the '08 recession, I joined Dassault Systems and was there for 10 years until I left in the summer of 2022. And then about a year later, started Schema as a co-founder with a great team and a couple other co-founders. Charlie Cicchetti, our CEO, Christina Bach, who's our president, and Richard Harpham. These are our four operational co-founders.
Hmm.
Uh, so you might know Richard. Richard used to run Autodesk marketing for a while,
Hmm.
including the AEC part of AU, and was the VP of software at Katera. So between myself and Richard, and then Errol Wolford, who was one of the original investors in Revit on our board, and then Steve, who's running our customer success team, we've got sort of four original people from the startup in this. This is totally different, but it's kind of fun to get the band back together and.
Awesome. So I'm curious then. I was, those early days of Revit, and what were you doing? You said product. What was it? Product.
I was the director of product management at the
Okay.
startup
Yep.
uh, when it was Charles River Software, and then
Hmm.
when it was Technology Corp, and then I was at Autodesk after the acquisition for a while,
That's awesome. Super
which
cool.
was my second time at Autodesk. So before I went to help work on the founding team at Revit, I was the product manager for Architectural Desktop at Autodesk.
Got it. Got it.
So a couple times at Autodesk, still know a lot of programmers at Autodesk, management at Autodesk, but
Were you
different role.
responsible for the red ring of death?
No, I can proudly say I was not responsible for any.
That's awesome. No, architectural desktop was definitely. I would say it was the gateway drug for me into Revit for sure. But that's pretty cool. Awesome. So yeah, we're not here to talk about Revit, or I mean, I guess sort of Revit, but definitely not architectural desktop. I can tell you that.
Yeah, for sure.
So Schema. I mean, I've I've read a couple things. You've sent me some stuff. I've looked on the website, but I'm excited to learn myself about it, and then also to introduce the audience to it. So maybe just as a general overview, give folks the concept of what is schema, and maybe we can start picking the pieces together at the sort of high level understanding before we really dig into the details.
Yeah, so schema can serve a number of different actors in the whole value chain of getting a building built. We've decided to focus on the architect first because we think the architects have to love using it for it to stick.
Hmm.
And many of us are architects from our past. So I was a practicing architect.
Hmm.
The guy running our engineering team was also a practicing architect. Christina Bach is still a licensed architect. Richard was an architect. So a number of us came from the profession and have some significant software experience.
Hmm.
For an architect, what Schema really does is two things. It allows you to iterate a scheme with a lot more confidence for an owner so that you can win the work easier at less risk.
Hmm.
Because a lot of that work is pursued without a fee agreement in place, and you're just kind of doing it, to convince the owner to go with you as your client.
Hmm.
And then the second thing Schema does from a business standpoint is once you get selected and you have that fee agreement, it can generate a chunk of the BIM deliverables so that you don't have to spend the weeks in Revit entering a whole bunch of stuff that you could get if you were able to more easily convert the schematic layout and other tools directly into Revit data. And we have some fairly, I think, clever ways that we do that. But the main thing is that we're not like a lot of the other offerings out there. So since I've been in this space on the software side for a long time,
Hmm.
one of the things I noticed about 6, 7 years ago is lots of people with Grasshopper scripts decided to turn them into apps and get VC funding. And so all of those apps come out of sort of a computational design
Hmm.
thinking. And while we have computational design in here, the thing about a script-based approach like that is you have to decide what problem you're going to solve and sort of write the script to solve it. And then when you have a problem that you didn't write the script for, you get to all the kind of edge cases, and then it doesn't really work that way.
Hmm.
So we're trying to, rather than do something like that, we're trying to make like a really open, flexible system that uses Revit data as input
Hmm.
so that actually the people at all these firms that have been, working on Revit projects for 10, 15, whatever many years, have some agency to actually take what they've created as IP that's kind of sitting there not doing anything
Hmm.
and use that to save themselves time and lower their risk as they go after new work. And the main thing is not making it cookie cutter so that it doesn't feel like you're just copying and pasting. What we're trying to do is we're trying to give a design app that really allows an exploration, but leverages basically the best hits of the knowledge you have from
Hmm.
from things you've done in the past, and which we find senior designers at these firms basically think like that. They look at a project and a site and go, "Yeah, this is kind of similar to this project I did like 6 years ago, and maybe I
Hmm.
could use that as a starting point." And of course, it's going to be different, but maybe I can leverage some of that stuff. And so that's the whole point of what we're doing with Schema on the architectural side.
So I'm interested because you mentioned sort of the automation side of it and Dynamo and Grasshopper scripts, etc. And so there also seems to be sort of a trend that I'm noticing of sort of everything being considered AI or everyone thinking
Yeah,
that this
right.
AI term. So I'm curious, as I do know that I believe that there's AI. Is this AI or is this automation? I mean, how would you sort of define what
Both.
Scheme is
It's
doing?
both. So when we originally went down this journey, Martin Day wrote an article, not this past March, but a year ago, March, that talked about what we were attempting to do.
Hmm.
And at that time, the hype cycle for AI was just sort of getting into its full
Right.
swing.
Hmm.
And at that point, I said, Martin, what we're doing is totally procedural and we're not using any AI. And the reason we're not is because we want completely predictable results.
Hmm.
We have changed our tune on that in that as we've worked with the early customers and figured out what we have to implement in order to ingest the Revit data in a way that we can scale it without breaking the backs of our services team,
Hmm.
we're using machine learning to help us scale things that we used to be doing by hand,
Hmm.
and now are leveraging some AI to be able to automate those things in a way that's not procedural, the way you might see Grasshopper scripts doing, layout solvers and things like that. That's one place where we're using AI.
Mhm.
The other place we're using AI is as part of giving this thing flexibility, we wanted to make it that if you have a chunk that comes out of Revit, you can reuse that out of the box just like you had it in your previous Revit projects. But the more interesting part is when you take the layout logic of that graph
Mhm.
of your chunk in Revit and you can change its size and shape, but it still respects your layout logic and it understands the constraints and the minimums and the maximums that you're working with.
Mhm.
So we do use an AI to do what we call morphing, where we take the previous chunk that we harvest out of Revit and put in what we call a design catalog. And then
Mhm.
as you look at new situations to apply that, and you want to fit it into something that wasn't the same shape as your previous project, we use an AI to do that alteration.
So forgive me if I'm going to step on some of your explanation, but I think because again, I'm trying to understand it myself too. So the concept here is we're basically, if I'm running a firm and I've got, I don't know, maybe let's say I'm doing schools. I do K through 12 schools, right? And that's
Right.
kind of the market sector. Obviously, maybe I do other stuff, but a big chunk of my work is K through 12 schools. Similar to healthcare and a few other ones, there's a lot of repetitiveness in that,
Yep.
right? You do
Yep.
a K through
Sure.
5 school, classroom sizes are very similar, programs is usually very similar, maybe some different mixed use places. So basically, here's my best 5 in the last 10 years projects, Revit models, right?
Yep.
The idea is load this into I mean, again, I'm going to try and simplify it for
Right.
non-technical brains. Load this into this server, let's say, or this platform, and then it takes all the best things from them and generates essentially a rule set that can then be driven to, okay, now I want to set up a schematic design for another school. It's taking all the best rules from all of that, and it can start laying it out based on parameters or constraints that you put in. Is that kind of the concept? So,
Yeah,
so
close,
close,
close.
close. We getting there.
I'll,
Okay,
I'll
okay.
I'll walk you through
Let's
it
go.
in
Let's go.
more detail. It's not as complicated as it sounds, actually.
Okay, okay.
Um, so what would be the best way to do that? I think maybe
You
some
can,
visuals
if you want some
help.
visuals, go for it. Yeah, I'll jump. As you're talking, I can flip to some of the visuals to help sort of go through it.
So one thing I want to mention is I hope people find this presentation inspirational. I would love to say that, I'm the smartest person in the world, but in all honesty, I've had the privilege of working with some really great teams. We had a really great team at Revit. We have a really great team at Schema. And the source of inspiration that I have is my creator, who is the source of all inspiration, um, and so I give all of that credit there. And so hopefully we're applying it here in a way that your audience will find inspirational and want to participate in.
Mhm.
What we took inspiration from in the big idea. I worked for an architect in the 90s who said, every project you do has to have a big idea, and the client has to understand that big idea. And I've taken that forward not only into building projects, but also the software. Revit had a big idea. The big idea behind Revit was that it was a stretchable cardboard model in a computer that knew how to make coordinated construction drawings. So that's
Mhm.
the one sentence big idea behind Revit.
Right.
The big idea behind Schema is that we take chunks of a building and turn them into reusable magnetic puzzle pieces that you can use to solve new buildings.
Mhm.
Um, and by doing that, we save an awful lot of effort. And there's a lot of tools out there that are doing schematic design or conceptual design in a web browser, right? And they're trying to make SketchUp in a web browser, or they're trying to make Revit in a web browser. And so people ask, are you competing against, TestFit or Revit or SketchUp? And I say we're competing against Tracepaper.
Mhm.
Right now, that's what people use. And so a lot of times we hold workshops in people's offices where, they've never seen this stuff before. There's nothing to install because it runs in a web browser. We create their accounts in the first 10 minutes of the meeting. We explain how it works in 15 minutes. 2 hours later, they have a building. And 2 minutes later, I have a Revit model of that building. And, they know how to use Tracepaper. They don't even really even use SketchUp, right? So
Mhm.
that's my user target. Um, it's going to be that. So the learning curve for this has been described as shallow by
Mhm.
senior designers. That is not to indicate that the implications of it aren't 10 miles deep. And
Right.
so that 10-mile deepness is described by this idea that was published in Refabricating Architecture. I don't know if you're familiar with it, that Kieran and Timberlake
Mhm.
put this out actually about the same time that Revit was launched. And it was the idea that if you look at manufacturing industries, they don't do things by taking all the parts to the final assembly point and trying to put them all together there. No, they have a tiered production system
Mhm.
that has that they make a sub-assembly and then they ship that, and so they are able to reduce the number of joints at final assembly and thus ensure quality and speed in a
Hmm.
way that we don't have in construction. And so a lot of ideas in refabricating architecture led to prefab approaches and other things in the means and methods, but it really never got its way into design. Um, and McKinsey did a study on, the diffusion of modern methods of construction into the industry. And they were predicting that about 25% of the total construction value chain was going to move to modular or prefab kind of stuff. And when they measured the impacts of that, basically everything in the chain got faster except design. Because when you start taking prefab approaches and the designer has to think, oh, I have to design it so it'll work in this delivery system,
Hmm.
it makes it harder to design. And a lot of what we've learned at Schema is from lessons other people had. There have been, as I said about people with Grasshopper scripts, a lot of people making applications targeted at real estate companies or owners to
Hmm.
try and generate things with those scripts. And, we know some of those people who created some of those apps. I would ask them, how do architects like it? And they say, oh, the architects hate it, right? Because they have to think about the modules and all this stuff. And
Right,
so
right.
even though the output of Schema might someday help that, our whole point is that you don't have to think about any of that stuff. But the principles behind refabricating architecture are sort of a nice foundation for describing what we do. The thing about the chunks that we use in this diagram is that they're not physical things that you prefab in a shop. They're virtual things that are already sitting there in your Revit files.
Hmm.
Right? So, and it doesn't have to be like, everybody shows apartment buildings, but it's interesting you brought up a school because
Hmm.
I'm going to show you an example of a school,
Hey,
right?
look at
We've
that.
done medical facilities. I've had 3 calls this week with just data center people, right?
Mm.
So, um,
Data centers are big right now.
yeah, and so it's the we have an open methodology and framework that if you know how to you have a bunch of Revit data, 2 Revit projects is enough to basically just
Hmm.
run this thing, right? So we're not one of the things is the whatever Revit data you put into this is your IP. It's not shared with any other architect.
Hmm.
We don't train an AI on it. So our approach to this AI topic is very, very different from other major tech vendors that are like, yeah, put your stuff on our cloud, and we're going to suggest good ways to use it. No, that's not what we do.
Hmm.
So the main thing for us is this, the tagline we have is schematic to bin in minutes, not months. Most of the projects that we do, when we get done with a charrette, we say, how long would this have taken you? And they say 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks
Hmm.
to do it manually in Revit. So the whole point of Schema, what makes it different is that it's not a throwaway conceptual feasibility tool. There are people using web-based feasibility tools. The problem they tell us is once I'm done with that, I still have to go enter all the data in Revit because I have to make the permit drawing so I can get paid and invoice the client.
Right.
I'm gonna turn off these timings because I didn't realize the timings were on. Sorry.
All good.
Uh, and then I've got Zoom putting stuff. All right, so let's get rid of timings because we're doing this off the cuff. So,
Right.
so these 3 things really, the we take the BIM system data as input. Now we talk about Revit a lot because a lot of the customers using our stuff are Revit users.
Hmm.
But we started with SketchUp data. We could start with IFC data, and likewise, we could push it out to Revit, which we do most of the time because most of our users are Revit users. But we could just as easily push it to ArchiCAD or IFC or whatever you want, really.
Hmm.
The methodology is generic. And that's sort of similar to Revit. It's like if you ask what building is Revit designed for? It's not designed for a building. It's designed as a methodology that you apply for making a coordinated perma set for pretty much any building. And that's the way that we're thinking about
Hmm.
schema. The thing about when we take the BIM inputs, we start with extracting them out of basically the office template that you have for a particular type of project. So if you're an architecture studio and you've got, say, a residential studio, and you've got a healthcare studio, and you've got a, who knows, data center studio, each of those is going to have a Revit template, right? And it has all of its various system families and other families in there and other standards that you have and the view templates you use for that type. And you might even have specific owner templates in that studio. So healthcare might have, say, a Kaiser Permanente
Hmm.
template that's just used on those topic projects.
Right.
That's how our design catalog is organized. So when we generate the Revit data, it's going to get generated into your template with your families, with your assemblies, the way that you would expect it to be, having used, having developed all your best practices for the last 15 years. That makes us very, very different
Hmm.
than some SketchUp in a web browser where you're building a bunch of stuff and then they're guessing at, oh, that looks like a curtain wall. Let's turn it into a curtain wall system family, right?
Hmm.
It's not generic stuff. It comes out very, very specific to the type of data your firm makes in Revit. And I think that's one of the main reasons why people that have seen it are excited about it. So the main thing, again, it's different than everything else because of those three things. You design with whole chunks of the building, and that's kind of, when somebody's a healthcare designer and they have to do a 100-bed hospital, they think, all right, how big is this 100-bed hospital? What are all the support spaces in each of the departments for a 100-bed hospital?
Hmm.
They have these rules of thumb that they've done because they've been a designer for a number of years. Same thing with any kind of school, right? If I'm doing an X high school, then what are all the support spaces for that many classrooms? We kind of organize it that way.
Hmm.
The other thing to know is that we're not a BIM system. We produce BIM data, but we're a knowledge graph system. So we call ourselves the first BIM knowledge reuse engine. But basically, a BIM system like Revit or Architectural Desktop for matter,
Hmm.
the users sit there and they pick points on a screen, and we pick a couple points and it creates a wall, and then you pick a point and it inserts a door, and you pick another point and it inserts a window, and then you pick some more points and it makes a ceiling or a floor or whatever. And that is the workflow of a BIM system. You're entering data, it's creating objects, it's adding metadata to those objects as you add constraints or tell this wall to go up to roof. It knows what things are attached to it, stores that metadata in the objects, and that's why it's called a building information model, because the information is stored in the objects. What we're doing is we're not operating at that level. What we're doing is you have a completed project for something. We look at that and we say, okay, there's a whole chunk of stuff in here that represents some captured knowledge about the way to lay out a surgery suite. Let's take that and make that a design catalog item so you can conveniently reuse it on a future project, as opposed to laying it out again. And so the way our app is organized is that there's a web app that has roughly these pieces of scope. These first parts are very similar to other web apps you might see, like Autodesk Forma, where we have you put in an address, it takes you to OpenStreetMap, you trace out a site boundary, it grabs all the 3D context, makes you a 3D site, and then you have massing tools so that you can do the massing. Nothing special there. It's kind of table stakes for making this kind of application. Then we also have simulation because whenever you're working in a project context to make a new project, you have to think about where the sun's coming from, where noise is, where, daylighting, all those sorts of things. So all of those things are things that we have in the early design part of the app where we really want to differentiate, and we've integrated with other apps. So we integrate with Cove Tool for some of the daylighting analysis.
Hmm.
We have just, we don't want to invent everything. We have a small team. We're realistic about what we can and can't write. We're not going to invent everything in the workflow. So we choose to partner a lot, and I'll be talking about that a bit. And so that's just a philosophy of ours. Where we really want to shine is in the block and stack, because when you're trying to then rationalize the main organizing principle of the building around, say, 100-bed hospital or X number of classrooms in a school, that's where we can really drive the layout of the overall idea of the building. And so mainly in the web app, you are doing that kind of layout to solve a word which seems to have gotten forgotten, the party of the building, which is the main organizing concept, right,
Hmm.
of the building. And when you make multiple options in schematic design, you're testing different parties to see which one works best. And that's basically what you do in schema is you test out these different parties. But the nice part about doing it in schema is that if you say, oh, I like this one, what would that look like in Revit? You can generate that result in a minute and look at it and go, that's good. Or I don't like that. I didn't realize that would happen. Let me
Hmm.
go back and change it and do it over again and generate it again and see what happens. That's a what if you can't do right now because that sort of what would it look like in Revit takes you 6 to 8 weeks.
Hmm.
So that's the main thing. And the other thing too is that 6 to 8 weeks in Revit, as you're using a parametric system that you move a wall and other things move, it introduces variance. And one of the reasons contractors don't trust Revit models is that variance doesn't easily get tracked because Revit doesn't have a tracking system built into it for that sort of stuff. Like you end up with a result, and then whatever that result is, it's the result. And so So one of the things about the way we do it is we kind of take this layout that you could, if you were a real masochist, do with groups in Revit. But there's all kinds of fraught with peril when you do it with groups in Revit. We take that out of Revit, allow you to do it in a much lighter weight way that doesn't fight with you, the way the constraint engine and parametrics and Revit fight with you. And then when you get to a result that you like, we just basically use the Revit API to jam it all back into Revit in one massive transaction so it can't complain. And there's all sorts of math involved in doing that, but we're pretty good at that math.
And so then, this generation of these blocks, or let's call them groups, because we're Revit users, so why not? But
And it
that's
is
happening.
groups, and I'll show it to you.
But what you're talking about in sort of this partie diagram phase of it, you're also saying that these groups, or these the pragmatic part of the partie, let's say, or the programmatic, let's say programmatic maybe,
Right. Programmatically driven.
a lot of that, or that's being grabbed or being laid out based on the wisdom gained from previous projects loaded into the system. Is that the concept?
It is, but we haven't evolved it to be that kind of knowledge system. We're not trying to replace the brain of the architect. Basically, we have solvers that are good for certain types of buildings. Like apartment buildings use a double loaded corridor a lot,
Right.
and they use single loaded corridor when they're not using a double loaded corridor. So pretty much with those two solvers, you can pretty much get every kind of apartment building. What we're working on now are much more complicated solves, the kind actually that you see in TestFit a lot, where you've got a much more complicated circulation space that kind of looks like a ladder in plan, where you've got main circulation and then you've got minor connecting corridors, and that creates, islands of things to lay out in the islands versus things around the perimeter. And then it's also driven in the fact that it's not just, say, a unit mix of apartments down a hallway. It's a multi-level solve where first you're solving circulation, then you're solving departmental adjacencies, then you're looking at all of the spaces within a department and what drives the layout of that department, and then across departments and horizontally and vertically. So factor into that situations that we find with the customers where things are designed actually to fit together. So we had a situation in a building design where people had thought about, how would they do this, and they made two L-shaped things that fit together. And so you can't really lay out one without laying out the other. And so those have inherent adjacency implications along with the program. So it's not so much that we're trying to boil the ocean when we read your Revit file in, as much as we have some solvers that apply to certain kinds of building types. And eventually we will use some of that knowledge to automatically extract from Revit files the thing that should be the puzzle pieces. But right now that's really more of a human process.
Got it.
The solvers themselves are pretty much programmatic, right? It's only when you start morphing things into different shapes that we get into the AI.
Got it. Well, I'm sure if the audience is like me, I can't wait to start seeing this. So I think what we'll do is we'll take a quick break. And then when we get back, we'll start running into some live demo and start to see this in action. So stick around, guys. We're going to hop over to a quick ad reel, and then we'll come back and we'll jump into some actual demo and some video. So give us 1 second here.
Yeah, so I'm Tom Flaherty. I'm currently working for a residential design firm called Lifestyle Design. We specialize in production residential for national home builders. Just recently claimed the title of BIM manager. I told my boss, I'm like, hey, I'm doing it anyway. I'm taking this title. He's like, okay, sounds good. I recently got licensed, now licensed architect in Wisconsin and Texas. Because I stumbled up on a couple of videos that you did on YouTube about how to do a standing seam roof, and I still use that hack. And it was just being able to learn that stuff you know, everybody uses that term, the hive mind, and that's kind of what it is. You know, you throw something out there, and there's at least one person who's done it or tried it and can guide you along the way, and everybody is so open about sharing everything they've learned, whether it was from you or somebody else. Or it's really made me a lot better modeler, a lot better Revit user, and it frees, and being able to use all these hacks frees up my time to learn other more exciting things.
All right, so
CIA.
so there you heard it. Thanks, Tom, who's a member of the BIM After Dark community, for that little ad reel there. This episode is being brought to you by the BIM After Dark community. If you guys don't know what that is a private community here on the interwebs, with a bunch of members like yourselves, where we not only have full-length courses, but we have online office hours, a live social feed where you can ask questions and chat and so on and so forth, and coming soon, in-person events. So if you're interested in joining, head on over to community.bimafterdark.com. We got a few members in the chat here today too, so feel free to ask them what they think of it. But either way, head on over to that link and feel free to reach out to me with any questions as we if you're thinking about joining. So all right, thanks for that little break. Thanks for hanging out, Marty. Sorry for the little interruption there, but I appreciate it. And so I think what we want to do is probably jump right back in. And I'm sure people are dying to start seeing some of this stuff. So let's jump in. We've talked a little bit about the concept of schema, the concept of sort of these parts, but then also the assemblies and building it to it, and then and sort of the schematic into the BIM model. So I guess maybe if you want to jump in, I see on your screen here, I'll show everyone what we're seeing here. Some looping GIFs of the idea, and maybe jump into what the process looks like, and show us what it is, man.
Yeah. So, like I said, this is the conceptual part of it that's kind of table stakes, So, SketchUp in a browser with push-pull massing and that sort of thing. So this is nothing special. We're not going to reinvent every massing tool, but our goal is that the solver should be able to work with any arbitrary mass that you can dream up in Rhino with arbitrary shaped floor plates by cutting that, and so that we can do a block and stack for anything, basically. As a result of that, we've already done a shape diver integration. We haven't exposed it yet, but basically the idea is you're going to be able to run your Grasshopper scripts right in the schema environment to generate whatever geometry you want that, our simple mass tools don't generate. So form is not really a limitation for us. Again, we want to be the ones to excel in the block and the stack and then generating the Revit data from it. The main thing that connects the mass and your overall idea for the building with that block and stack is this idea of the design catalog. And this is where we get into Revit. So the way that we work with the Revit data is that there is a Revit plugin that you install that connects one of your Revit templates that has a bunch of groups for the chunks that you want to reuse. And what we will do is we will parse those to determine what is the graph of adjacencies of the space in there, what things do they contain, what are the bounding conditions, and what families are those. And we'll load that all up into a unit in our database. And so we extract all those graphs out of your BIM. As we get more and more and more of these, and we face more situations where we might have to morph things into different shapes, and we have interlocking shapes and things like that, that's where we introduce more and more machine learning. Because, if you only have a dozen of these things and you have maybe a dozen cases, that's not too bad. Once you have thousands or tens of thousands, then we need something to be able to look at what's the most likely thing that could be successful in this particular situation. So that's when we'll start to suggest stuff. Whatever we do with the solver, though, you have the ability to change. So there's a human in the loop, and then we kind of learn from that, and we optimize how we make suggestions and do solving layouts in the future. So that's kind of the method we use. So what these puzzle pieces look like when they're extracted out of Revit and put into our system, they sort of look like simplified representations of what you might find. So I'm showing you an apartment building example. But this can be any kind of chunk, anything that can be a group, right? I joke with Jim, we need a pickleball Revit file so we can do schema pickleball automation. And in any case, I'm only half joking because we could do it. And
Right.
it's like, what's the difference between pickleball courts and data center units? So like
Hmm.
it's in a way it's topologically very similar.
Hmm.
In this, however, even though it's a simplified representation that we call a puzzle piece,
Hmm.
when you put this into Revit, you're going to see all the stuff that's in these spaces, right? So we're
Hmm.
just showing you a very simplified representation so you can understand the orientation of this unit, what the
Hmm.
exterior is, where the part that connects to circulation is. And that's how this works. The other part is that you can take something that might look like this in Revit that was very regular from the building that it came from,
Hmm.
and you can start to morph it into completely different situations that follow the same layout logic because that piece of AI does that morphing. Now, we're very intentional that if you decide to take something that's a standard unit and invent a new unit, we track that now that is a different unit.
Hmm.
So this is why when you come to prefab stuff, say in the future, we will be able to track branches of units that you've made by making design decisions in a way that's much more intentional than
Hmm.
if you just sort of exploded a group and modified it in Revit. There's no tracking of something like that.
Hmm.
So really quickly, to give you the big idea, and then we'll jump into the actual software,
Hmm.
take chunks out of Revit, we turn them into puzzle pieces with a Revit plugin.
Hmm.
Those puzzle pieces will show up on the left side of our editor when you're working in a plan.
Hmm.
And we have generators so the apartment example, this famous one is double loaded corridor. So, you trace out the circulation space for a double loaded corridor, and we will lay out based on where that corridor is. And we'll use a unit mix to determine how many of each of these things we'll have.
Hmm.
You can adjust that. You can say, no, I want to change that. I want to put the two bedroom on the corner. I want to delete all these. I want to put them in. I want to put in a placeholder for a core, and I'll figure that out later in Revit. So you don't have to do all the work here.
Right.
Our goal is not to generate a 100% complete building. It's
Hmm.
to get to like 50, 60% complete. Whatever to use on a floor, you can make a template for another floor. You can take the template, change it to be a different condition, duplicate it, and then morph the units to these new shapes. And again, we'll track the fact that they're a branch of that unit.
Hmm.
As you work, we'll track all the analytics so that you understand how many of each unit you have, how much of each type of space you have. And then whatever you have in schema, the whole point is that it turns into high quality Revit data. And then whatever comes out of this is typically at the level of completion ready for doing construction documents from.
Hmm.
So that's the idea in a nutshell. And for us, you use it, come up with something that looks like that. And it's all about the initial solves that we do for a mass and then how you use the puzzle pieces as sort of like magnetic Lego blocks to go and experiment so that you can come up with something new and creative. So why don't I just jump into Schema for a minute and show you some stuff. So
Before
I
before you
don't,
jump into that, there's a question in the chat by
yeah.
Emil, and I think it actually probably could fit in right here, which goes back to that concept of
Mhm,
the puzzle pieces from Revit. So the
mhm.
question was, I'm going to reword it a little bit, but along the lines of like, how good does the Revit template or information need to be that's feeding it into it? Is there, I think the word Emil used was, does it need to be perfect? But
No,
but I guess in general, like what are I mean, is it taking anything, or there's some kind of
I would
guidelines
say if you're
of
using Revit the normal way most Revit users would use it, then it's okay. If you're like modeling everything with in-place family massing and like, dropping DWG files in, you're gonna whatever you give us, you're gonna get out. So if you give us
right,
garbage, you're gonna get garbage outs. But most people aren't doing that, right? Most people might cheat in a wall section, but most of the model-based stuff, system families and other components that you're using are generally pretty workable,
and
right?
I noticed, when you were showing that idea of puzzle pieces, again, they're using groups within Revit. Is that something that, ideally you're grouping when thinking about this model being now uploaded for this use? Are you going back and saying, okay, let's use classrooms as an example again. Let me take, these classrooms, make a group out of it, call it classroom type A1. This one, call it
Yep,
classroom type A2,
yep,
which is something you may not do in the normal workflow of that project, just depending on
right.
that. But it makes sense to do it for the sake of this knowledge base.
Right. And so just because so we've done multiple versions of this interaction with Revit creating the puzzle pieces.
Hmm.
We've used the linked file workflow and we used the group workflow.
Yeah.
Based on about a year's worth of customer input, we've decided the group workflow is better. And part of the
Hmm.
reason for that is we don't have the problems that Revit has when you use groups for this, and you get like weird situations with
Yeah.
double rising walls and that sort of stuff. And the way that we do it is that we have the graph of the unitized layout, but
Hmm.
then all of the intersections between them and the demising conditions we draw programmatically as we generate the Revit data. So
Hmm.
again, we don't Revit doesn't fight with us because of the way we jam it back into Revit in a way that Revit doesn't mind.
Hmm.
But there's a lot of devil in that details, and so that's just one thing
Understood.
to know.
Understood.
So the I won't really get into the concept, how you create a site. It takes 30
Hmm.
seconds. If you know how to create a site in Forma, like we're just like maybe 5 steps less than what you do in Forma to create a site, but takes 30 seconds.
Hmm.
And you get a 3D site. And so, I was talking about a school. So here's a school example. And this is a school actually we're using as a demo to show kind of integrated generation of multiple things.
Hmm.
Um, this is an actual school in Massachusetts. And um, and so this is a mass model that we'll actually use the regular units are on the bottom, and we'll use morphing to get to the strange shapes on the top.
Hmm.
The what I'll show you is how the catalog works for you to do this, and then I'll just do a simple example of,
Sure.
say, laying out an apartment. But again, um, right now, if we just look at key figures, right, you can see at this level of resolution, here's your breakdown of all the different grades
Hmm.
and all of the different area totals, right? So we have this reporting that's live as you work, and then we even have this sort of like a supercharged version of an Excel pivot table where
Hmm.
I was just talking, like I said, I was talking to data center people, and they're like, "We want to track these weird things that you normally wouldn't track because it's not like tracking apartment units." I'm like, "Oh, don't worry. If you can put it into a group
Right.
in Revit, you can
If
track
this
it
if it's there as a model
in the
element with
reporting
data, we're
tool."
tracking
Exactly.
it, right?
I guess the other thing too is that we're based around, so we have a concept of layers, but the way that our layers work is the building is made up of blocks, and each block has floors, and then the floors contain the units, right?
Hmm.
So we have a site and we have buildings on the site. So we can have multiple buildings. And then for a project, you can have multiple options, right? And if I say, oh, I want to make version B of this, I can just say, okay, duplicate this. And then I'm going to call that version B. And then I'm working in version B.
Hmm.
So the thing about our editor is that even though the team is going to generate Revit data for one or all of these scenarios, they all work off the same catalog
Hmm.
and multiple people can be working on different options simultaneously. So like I could be working on option A, somebody else could
Hmm.
be working on option B, somebody else could be working on option C, and then at the end of the day we all compare and say, and this is actually how we run a workshop. We just have a room full of people all doing one brief.
Hmm.
And then 2 hours later we all compare the solutions,
Hmm.
which is super fun actually. Um, so this is, the school example. Just we're one of the things that we've done is we've done an integration with Thornton Tomasetti's Asterisk Stack for doing structural generation.
Okay.
And so in this particular project, we're generating the architectural scope in Revit. We're generating the structural scope using TT. We're going to be generating LOD 400 piping. So this is going to be a pretty interesting project for the implications of um, going from design to pre-construction. And I actually see scenarios, for instance, in the business of architecture where, um, as a third party, we may be a channel where the architect's model can be used by a subcontractor wanting to bid to generate their piping layout with, say, a fee paid back to the architect who allowed the schema data to be used downstream by, say, a subcontractor. So there are potentials for completely different business models
Yeah.
that we don't have right now, which we don't. Like I said, we don't have all the answers. We're just trying to create a flexible system that poses some opportunities for people.
Hmm.
So if I jump out of the project for a second and just go back to um, my folder, so I'm just in our sort of schema company folder, and there's lots of things going on, like intern training and different various projects. So I just put my stuff in my Marty folder here. Um, if I go into the right now it's called unit catalogs. I'm trying to get it just change the design catalog because we're doing unitized design.
Hmm.
So I have a couple here. So when we first started the morphing, the internal project name for that was Morph Ninja. So I actually asked Midjourney to make me a picture of a Morph Ninja. So it cut off the Morph Ninja's head, but that's actually the Morph Ninja right there.
Nice.
So I have this hotel catalog. I have this schools catalog. When you open up Schema, you're going to find a sort of an increasing number of sample catalogs in our catalog hub.
Hmm.
And if you want to use, say, the residential catalog, this school catalog will end up being one of these example catalogs that you can use and play with. But I think the main fun is going to be making your own.
Hmm.
You can just add it to your schema tenant by hitting the plus, and then it'll take a copy of that and it'll put it over here. So now you can use this residential catalog. So there's sort of an inventory of things that you might use. And the same thing with the office. You might have an inventory of things, and then
Hmm.
people choose to use those. And same thing, you can have published catalogs and not published catalogs. So let's say I go into the residential catalog that I just added. You will see things that are these mirror the groups
Hmm.
in the Revit file that this was taken from.
Hmm.
And they have certain metadata about the layout. They show you where the doors and windows are and the bounding conditions and what type of unit is and some basic metrics. Um, you can also block out spaces that you don't have a unit for. Like, let's say you're doing the school and you just want to block out a bunch of space for cafeteria and you're going to go design that in Revit later, or the gym or
Hmm.
whatever. You can just block that out. And when we generate the building, we're going to use the default assembly. So anything
Hmm.
that is represented by a unit of Revit data that we've taken from a group, if I dive into one of these, you're going to see that it's giving you just a line diagram of it. But when this turns back into Revit data, whatever this wall type was and whatever this wall type was in Revit, that's what's going to get reinstantiated when we put it back in your Revit project.
Hmm.
And here you see the contents that are associated with this with this puzzle piece diagrammatically. So when we put it back in the Revit, you're going to get all this stuff too, but you're not going to see that stuff in Schema because we're not going to expose that detail.
Right.
And we have the ability, for instance, to set constraints. So we might say this should be a minimum of 10 feet, and let's 10 inches, and then let's turn it to, it can stretch as far as I want, and 999, whatever. Um, Whereas that's a locked length,
Mm.
and the idea is that, if you lock something in Revit, we will inherit that in here, but you can test the stretching behavior in this environment so that you can design units that have certain behaviors when you use them in the editor and then when they produce the Revit data. And to me, we just literally released this on Tuesday.
Hmm.
So, it's 2 days old. So there's plenty of more stuff that we're going to put in here, but
Right.
that's the basics of it for now. So again, if I hop back into the residential catalog, there's a whole bunch of these. If I open one up, it's going to have the layout in there.
Hmm.
Pretty much you can understand this. I'll show you then how this was generated by just showing you video. But if I go back into the residential catalog and jump back into the units, if I go to the schools catalog, what I see is a little bit different. Here I
Right.
have units for schools. I have an art room. It has a kiln in this corner. The kiln, I'm going to change the color of the kiln because so that it doesn't look like, the other units, say, make it purplish. So now my kiln is purple, right? So you set your colors on a per project basis
Hmm.
in this environment, and your default assemblies for things that aren't themselves something unitized that was taken from a group. And that's what controls the generation of the Revit project data as you get done with a scheme in Schema. So here's how this thing gets created, and I'll just show you a video of it. Because I'm on a Mac, so I'm not running Revit here. But basically, right, you have a Revit template that has these groups defined,
Hmm.
and you launch a Schema plugin. And what that's going to do is that's going to grab out all those units, upload them, synchronize it with the cloud, and then in our environment, this is where you manage them. Those then go into that sidebar, and you can either use a generator to lay them out or drag and drop them. And in this case, we're morphing them to be different shapes.
Hmm.
And that's the main, that's the main thing. Oops, I just moved this over off of my, let's see here. Get out of full screen. Okay, good. All right, so if I go back just into
Before you go, you stopped sharing. You got to share again.
sorry.
It's all good.
Share
All
again.
good.
We're just winging it here.
No, it's
Okay,
all good. Just want to make sure you don't start getting on a
here we go.
nice little run there and no one sees what you're doing. You know.
Gotcha. Thank you for that.
Perfect. We're good now.
So let's say I go into, I'll do something that's residential. Um,
Before you jump into that though, I think it's there's a point there that we is worth highlighting. That sort of that I'm seeing. So, you know, when it comes to, I mean, me, thinking myself as an architect and seeing tools, the AI generation tools that are doing these things where it's showing you, I don't want to say test fit as the tool, but like test fits in general of spaces,
Yeah.
right? And so what I love about this is like you're kind of creating your test fits, right? And then you're creating the rules. You're still designing to some extent, right? It's your design.
Exactly.
It's not, because those all feel very artificial in the sense of like, so it's coming from somewhere that's not you at all. Whereas here, you could be you're taking a concept like you showed with those catalogs, and I love that. So you're then from there, it could still, you have possibilities of expanding and reconfiguring and using it, but you're starting with this template that you just showed, which is essentially, your firm's designs of projects, which I think it's pretty neat. So it's a different, like you said, it's a little bit of a different take on utilizing
Yeah, and
something like.
and so as opposed to having to set up a bunch of data by entering data before you can use the product, we're, starting in Revit. So basically what we're doing here is we're just as a Revit user, we're giving you agency to say, whatever you want to turn into a group, whether it's apartment units or, pickleball courts or data center power units, go for it. And it doesn't, right now we show walls bounding it, but something which is basically internally the same class as a wall is an area separation line. So it doesn't mean that there have to be walls bounding these things, but this is a method for tracking space so that we can produce the metrics. So we generally need things that bound space in Revit in order to be able to do that sort of stuff. So I've mentioned that. Now I haven't actually tested it since we only released this 2 days ago. So if it isn't there this week, it will probably be there in a few weeks. But we're evolving very, very quickly at Schema. We're not like big software companies that have like 3-year roadmaps. We do things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I like about this, and I've always, even when it came to the generative design and some of those examples you were talking about before, I just, for me, and I have a feeling, I'm sure a lot of architects feel this way, like going in and just going through a list of parameters and selections to generate, it's just not how we work, right? And then so that's why it's always even like facade generators, like all these tools, it's like you start with like a list of parameters to pick, and it's like I want to start with visual, and then and that this is how I think that's how most of us work. So I like that concept. I think it's really cool.
So the way that the one thing that's probably the only part that's not super intuitive is that the way that you get to the catalog is by editing a floor, because the floors are templates, right? So when I highlight something, it's going to tell me in the tooltip what I will be selecting if I click right there, which is similar to the way Revit does with the tabbing of the pre-highlight. So if I tab, I'm going to the block, or I'm going to the whole building, or I'm going to the floor, right? So this building only has one block in it, but if it had multiple blocks, you would see the selection change. If I select the floor, then I can go and edit it. And when I edit it, then I get the ability to select the catalog on the left. Now, this one was created prior to our releasing the catalog, so it just doesn't know that there's a catalog associated with it. So rather than breaking it, I'm just going to mess with the ones I have right now. So I can pull, this out and slide things over. But what I'm just trying to show you is that when I grab one of these things, you see that little white dot?
Yep.
That's like a magnet, right? So as I get it close, it snaps to that corner, and I can just let it go, and I don't need to precisely position, right? It's done the accurate positioning for me just by magnetizing the corners, because these things generally have corners by which you're dragging them around. So that's the main editing interface is this floor editing.
Mhm.
And this is how we use the generator. So let me just go to a version of this model that doesn't have a layout associated with it, and then I'll set a catalog for it, and I might blow it up because we'll see. That's the hazard of doing things after you've released it 2 days ago. So
Right.
let's say I go here to this option. Um, and so right now I could still edit this as if it was a polyline. So I can just like take this end and drag it around,
Mm.
right? When I want to do the actual layout, I need to do something called baking. So I would take this tab to the building
Mhm.
and bake it. And then I can edit it as well, maybe let me just do a new one. In fact, let me just do a new project.
There we go. While you're doing that, there was a couple questions that we could probably fill in as you're opening up.
Yeah.
Which I think one was what happens. You selected the top floor. If you edit like a floor in the middle, I think the question was probably like, graphically, what does it look like?
Yeah,
And
graphically. So if I go back here and I just
sorry, I know you were in the middle of doing that.
yeah,
So
no problem. So graphically, what happens if I select this one
yeah,
and I hit edit, it's just going to chop off the top of the building so that I can
perfect.
see the active floor. The other thing too is I can go into 2D and edit it there.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got some uh we're in the middle of implementing the grid, so it's easier to rotate screen to orthogonal. But
Hmm.
right now it's matching basically what the true north of the site is when you go to 2D.
Right, right. And the other question was um, implementing with existing building or retrofits. I'm assuming that just means that you're laying out the existing building as the building
Yeah,
type, and then using
that's a
using the
great
unit
question,
types. Or
actually. And in fact, one that I think I'll just cover since we're just
yeah,
spitballing this anyway.
yeah.
If I go back into the sort of top level, we actually have a commercial office building owner that's the owner of this building that is one of our investors.
Hmm.
And got into this pickle in that he had this blue chip tenant, but because it was an office building, the bank wouldn't give him the tenant improvement loan because his collateral was worth too little now. So he's like, well, I need to find out something else to do with this. And I know you guys, can figure out feasibility plans for buildings. So could you tell me, what this would look like as an apartment building or as something else?
Hmm.
And so we did. Now we said we are not architects and we are not licensed for fire and life safety and all that sort of stuff. So we got an architect friend very well to go and help us with since he's done lots of hotels and whatnot.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we did this project here where basically what we did was he sent us the plan and we took that into Schema. And if I just rotate this around and zoom in, you can kind of when we put a an image into Schema, it assumes it's going to be a site
Mm.
image, and so it just deforms it to the topography. But so you can kind of see his office building floor plan there. And then what we did was we masked that out and we chopped out the elevator cores
Hmm.
and the circulation. If I go to 2D, you'll see it just kind of lays right over,
Yeah.
the PDF he sent us. And this is a feasibility exercise, so it doesn't have to be perfect. But then basically we use that with the standard unit layout to do something like this.
Mm.
Um, but the thing is, this doesn't give us something optimal because the units themselves, this is a deeper floor plate. So,
Right.
we have a 20-foot corridor width, so that doesn't really work. So that's when the morphing came into it. And so when we did morphing, we came up with something that looks like this.
Mm.
So now our usable space for rentable is much better.
Right.
And then we put an amenity space in the center. And then when we use that as a template, we got a building layout that looked like that. And let's back up. And then if we go to the key figures, you can see, all right, so you'd get roughly 264
Mm.
units here, and we also had to guess at the parking since he didn't
Yeah.
send us below grade plans, but basically that's what it looks like for this. And then we did another one, if we go to the options where we did a hotel, where we used a hotel catalog so that now when we go to the key figures, you'll see,
Mm.
we got suites and
Suites
king
versus
studios and that
Hmm.
sort of stuff, and the metrics are different, starting with the same, basic envelope,
Right.
right? So it can work in adaptive reuse. It definitely, the sweet spot is new build, but it definitely works in adaptive reuse as well.
Nice. No, that's really cool.
And we actually, we've been looking at adaptive. One of the things our healthcare architects tell us is that they're not doing a lot of new build. Is that they're getting lots of, I need to take this space and turn it into a health clinic, and that they're super fast.
Yeah.
So that's one of the cases that we're working on.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. No, that's great. Maybe if you want to jump back into real quick.
Yeah, and I know that, wow, we're just flying through here. So
no, I think for the sake of posterity, I think I do want you to go maybe to, I think the one piece that people are probably, and I think you showed in the video, maybe you have another video too, is the taking now this mass and into Revit, and sort of what, maybe we dig into that just a little bit more of what that looks like.
So this is a picture from an actual workshop we did in an architect's office. So this was done in, a couple hours in Schema, and then a couple minutes later you had it in Revit, right? And that's the whole point, is that same plugin that uploads the puzzle pieces to Revit. You use the same to pull from the Schema cloud back into Revit. And we've done that. We have two different Revit generation pipelines. We've used platform services. We used platform services for about the last year. We've decided to do it with a Revit plugin using the API, specifically because a lot of the customers said, well, I want to take the data that I'm pulling in and push it right to ACC, right? Or some other cloud store that their Revit instance already has access to. So that was just the easiest way for us to enable all those workflows by giving people the agency to just do inside Revit, however they have Revit configured right now. The data that goes into Revit is, people that do downstream data generation, from Revit have told us that the Revit data we send them is way cleaner than any of the Revit data they get from any architect, because all of our stuff is procedurally generated. So if you're in Revit, you won't be able to tell it from a Revit model that's drawn by hand. Other than there won't be any weird stuff.
I was just gonna say, yeah, you're eliminating the 3 months of crazy family types and the designers are doing, right?
And it'll come in grouped, right? But of course, you don't need to keep the groups if you don't want to. You can just explode all the groups. But a lot of people like to leave it grouped, because that way you can make an edit to the group and it'll update the whole plan. This particular project, the podium was hand modeled in Revit, and then the apartment bar was modeled in Schema, and then they're two linked files combined on the site. So doesn't mean you have to do the whole project in Schema. Like I said, we're not here to generate necessarily 100% of the building. We're trying to be the fastest way for you to get to 50, 60% complete. And then you take it wherever you want to. You can take it into Revit. You can take it into ArchiCAD. You can take it to anything that reads IFC. You can take it into Snaptrude. I don't really care where you take it. You can do whatever you want with it, really. It's your data, and you use it however you want.
And so beyond just pulling in the units, the catalog, and whatever you're building in Schema, is there any other aspects being generated? Sheets, names, view names, any of that stuff, or is it just model information that we're talking about?
So we have done that. So what we put out into Revit is essentially construction document ready. Just as an R&D exercise, we took a standard vanilla copy of Glyph and just ran through it and documented one of our models just to prove that it would work. And so that's fine.
How'd it do? Did it do pretty good?
It did pretty well.
Yeah.
I'm no expert Glyph user, but it did pretty well. On our roadmap, we will be generating documents. I wouldn't be surprised to see in the same place that you manage catalogs that you could do a cartoon set and basically say, here's my sheet set and all the views. And then when we write the Revit data, we'll just generate the sheets, generate the views, annotate them, and put them on the so that you have the starting point, right? So that's not in the product today. That is on the roadmap item. But
I think to some extent
it's not that complicated a thing to do once we're writing all of this 3D data.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, I guess if you're a firm that's doing a lot of this work, your template may be set up pretty well for this potentially ahead of time anyways, right? So ideally you're getting half of it done. But I do think, like you're saying, that's kind of where my mind was going, was this concept of, if you're adding a level, if you're adding a unit, unit types or something like that, then you are cartooning the building anyway. Like, a lot of that stuff, like you're saying, it is kind of formulative, right? It's if it's based, if you're doing an apartment building, for example, based on a number of floors, based on a number of unit types, this is kind of going to be your cartoon set. So I was, that's kind of where I was going from. And then, projects like, or softwares like Glyph, and the other thing I was thinking of was when it comes to groups, if you're binding annotations in groups, is that something that can get pushed and pulled through the data spectrum too?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we're going to surface all those cases. So, like I said, we aren't the ones with all the answers. We're basically this has happened in the early days of Revit when we had like, 15 very close customer relationships that were partner relationships where we got really honest feedback to guide what are the most important use cases so that we would build the right product and get the product to market fit. That's the phase we're in. We launched this last June at the American Institute of Architects, so it's not even a year old yet. The code base, however, had 5 years of work done on it prior to our launching it. So we've got about 6 years of development into the code base now, and there's whole chunks of it that we have not exposed in the product yet. One of the things I did want to talk about for the old BIM users that remember the McClamey curve from the early days of BIM that had the sawtooths about losing the data and wanting to make a model out of it, is that those sawtooths still exist. They're not as big as they used to be, but still, when you go from SketchUp into Revit, you've got to start over. So what we're hoping to do by being able to take our role in for instance, working closely with SketchUp, we've had customers that model up the mass in SketchUp and do the block and stack in Schema, and then do some facades in SketchUp. And we're actually, talking to Trimble about, integrating that workflow. We have a curve that looks something like this, so that, right, there is no data loss going through that schematic part of the process. And then rather than having to then re-enter the data, in fact, because we can generate it, we go the opposite direction, right? So this is where that 6 to 8 weeks come from. It's because, this manual effort is what we're getting rid of to get to the same point in time. So that's just diagrammatically might be useful for people to understand this claim that we're making. Other than that, people have said some nice things about us. So there are a few quotes. And I'll just not dwell on them, but I like citing them. And then, pretty much these are the things that we see on projects. This is the reason for wanting to try it out. And so, what I'll just say is go to the site. The homepage is a pretty good description of, what we do. It's been updated recently, so if you weren't there this week, look again. We've got sort of an officialization of all the various things that we're doing with it. And some of the videos that I showed and some of the concepts that I showed. So if you need to explain it to somebody, the homepage is a really great way to do that.
Fantastic.
And then, here's a QR code that will take you to a sign-up form, and we're going to be doing a webinar that goes into the catalog manager and some of the other particulars. But you can sign up for a trial. There's a 30-day free trial. One of the other things, if you're in the trial and just learning how to use Schema, is that on the site, if you go to support in the Knowledge Center, you'll just see bunches and bunches of, videos of specific workflows that if you get stuck, you can go here. And then in the product itself is this help, right? And the first thing that will happen when you jump into this is there will be an onboarding, which they literally call training in minutes. But for the early Revit guys, if you remember when we were coming out and we were shipping in DVD cases, and we were, AutoCAD was still shipping in a big box with 2 feet thick of manuals or whatever it was, and we shipped with that 1/8 inch thick booklet for you to learn it. This is sort of the same thing. It's just now we virtualized it, so the actual product tour will walk you through how to use Schema in about 15 minutes. So. Awesome. So that's the idea. Take a look at that. If you are, have gone through this and go, I want to get more serious and I want to have some other people and have one of these workshops that you were talking about, just go into the support and hit a message. The support team that holds those workshops monitors that, and you can just ask them to put you on the list to have a workshop with them.
Awesome.
That's pretty much it from my side.
Fantastic. So schema.ai is the website. I'll put links below. I appreciate you coming on, Marty. This has been awesome, eye-opening and super exciting stuff. I didn't realize it was that new. I've heard of Schema for a little bit now, and people have been talking about it, but I didn't realize only a year and a half or something. Yeah,
it's about a year.
That's awesome.
It's about a year. We launched it last June, so it's almost officially a year.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on and willing to show us what it's about. I think some folks are probably jazzed about it, so hopefully they reach out. And any other final words before we wrap up?
No, this was a blast. Thanks so much for having me on. It's always fun to talk about Revit, and Talk about ways to maybe make using it a bit easier.
Hell yeah. Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much again. And everyone else who is here live, thanks for joining us live. Definitely head on over to community.bimafterdark.com if you want to become a member. Again, head on over to schema.ai, subscribe to the channel here. And with that, I want to bid you all adieu. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon. See ya.
Thanks.